The 1970s were a wild, electric time. It was the golden era of rock and roll, when names like Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones and Aerosmith weren't just bands, they were gods. And trailing behind them were the groupies. Young women drawn to the glitz, the chaos, and the dream of being close to the music. Magazines romanticized them. Movies hinted at their glamour. But few knew what life as a groupie truly involved. These girls, many still teenagers, weren't just hanging out for selfies and status. They were fans, yes, but more than that, they became muses, companions, and often victims. Back then, being a groupie was framed as liberation, a rebellion against suburban life and traditional values. But beneath that rebellion was a murky world of exploitation. Many of them started by sneaking into concerts, hoping for a glimpse of their heroes. Others were invited backstage by roadies or crew members, chosen for their looks or enthusiasm. What seemed like a dream quickly became something else. The backstage world wasn't all champagne and guitars, it was often a blur of drugs, manipulation, and blurred consent. Rock stars held all the cards. They had fame, influence, and entourages that made sure the girls came and went without a fuss. Some girls saw it as a rite of passage. Others were simply too young to understand what they were being pulled into. But they kept coming, because the music told them it was worth it. Because no one was warning them it wasn't. And at the center of this chaos were bars like the legendary Rainbow Bar and Grill in Los Angeles, a place where stardom and seduction collided, night after night. To outsiders, it was iconic. To insiders, it was a feeding ground. The Rainbow Bar wasn't just a hangout spot, it was an institution. Located on Sunset Strip, it became the epicenter of rock and roll nightlife in the 70s. On any given night, you could see Lemmy from Motorhead playing video poker at the bar, or David Bowie holding court in the back. It was electric, chaotic, and dangerously seductive. But for many groupies, the Rainbow was more than just a nightlife hotspot, it was a gate to the inner world of rock royalty. They came in droves, dressed to stand out, hoping to catch the attention of someone who mattered. And often, they did. But the cost of that attention was rarely questioned, because everyone was chasing the same thing, access. Older musicians, some pushing into their 30s and 40s, routinely targeted girls barely out of middle school. The age of consent was a loose idea in these circles, often dismissed entirely under the fog of cocaine and leather jackets. Drugs were part of the currency. You wanted to be accepted? You had to play along. And saying no didn't always work. Some girls fell into relationships with these stars, relationships that, from today's perspective, were clearly exploitative. But back then, society romanticized it. Songs were written about these muses. No one questioned how young they were, or whether they had a choice. They were seen as lucky, as cool, as part of the scene. Behind the scenes, the reality was far uglier. Girls were passed around. Their worth was measured by their willingness. And if they spoke up, they were ignored, or worse, pushed out and replaced by someone more compliant. The Rainbow was a dream for many, but for others, it was a place where innocence died. Some groupies faded into obscurity. Others became legends in their own right. But a few took darker paths that exposed just how twisted this world could be. One such figure was Cathy Smith, a name many didn't know until it made headlines for the worst reasons. Cathy started like many others, young, wide-eyed, and in love with the scene. She followed bands, partied with them, and quickly became known in rock circles. But her story didn't stop at groupie status. She became involved with musicians like Levon Helm and Gordon Lightfoot. Later, she crossed paths with John Belushi, the beloved comedian from Saturday Night Live. It was with Belushi that Cathy's name became infamous. In 1982, John Belushi died from a drug overdose at the Chateau Marmont. It was Cathy Smith who had injected him with a fatal mix of heroin and cocaine, a speedball. She was later convicted of involuntary manslaughter and served 15 months in prison. Suddenly, the world couldn't ignore what had always been there: the drugs, the recklessness, the blurred lines. Her story wasn't an isolated tragedy, it was a symptom. The rock world was a place with no rules and no oversight. What started as liberation often ended in addiction, trauma, or worse. For many women in that world, it was never about power, it was about surviving in a system built for men. Cathy's fall from fame shattered the romanticized groupie myth. It exposed how far things had spiraled, and how little the outside world truly knew. Her story wasn't a cautionary tale, it was a mirror to an industry that had stopped caring a long time ago. For decades, the stories stayed buried. Groupies were either dismissed as fame-hungry or erased from history altogether. Their experiences were left out of documentaries and memoirs. No one wanted to touch the truth, because doing so meant confronting the heroes we once worshipped. But then came the MeToo movement. Suddenly, voices that had been silent for years began to speak up. Women who were once girls in backstage rooms started sharing what had happened to them. They told of coercion, of being drugged, of being too young to say yes and too afraid to say no. And slowly, the world began to listen. It became clear that what was once accepted as part of the scene was never okay. The rock stars who were praised for living wild lives were now being re-evaluated through a lens of accountability. Books and documentaries started telling the stories differently, this time, from the women's point of view. The idea of the groupie is no longer something to glamorize. It's something to understand, to see it for what it really was, a complicated, often exploitative system dressed in sequins and leather. And while the music remains legendary, the silence around its darkest corners is finally being broken. Because every time we uncover the truth, we get closer to a world where no one is too powerful to be held accountable. And maybe, just maybe, the next generation won't have to sacrifice their safety for a chance to stand near the stage.